Moscow, 2002. It's a misty evening, warm for late October, and at the Dubrovka Theatre, 4 kilometers east-southeast of the Kremlin, over 1,000 theatregoers are ready to see a play. The production this evening is Nordost, based on the fictional story The Two Captains, and every seat in the house has been sold. But little does the audience know that what lies ahead isn't just a performance of the play that they paid to see. Instead, they're about to become pawns in a deadly chess game, one that will see many among their number killed before the night is out. On the one side, the forces of modern Russia, the Federal Security Service, or FSB, Russian Special Forces, the Spetsnaz, an elite National Guard unit known as the SOBR, and the man at the center of Moscow himself, Vladimir Putin. On the other, dozens of insurgents hailing from the nearby region of Chechnya, led on the ground by one Shamil Basayev, but commanded by Shamil Basayev, a brutal warlord and guerrilla leader who had made it his mission to become the nemesis of the Russian state. Their demands? An unconditional and immediate withdrawal of Russian forces from Chechen soil. The retribution they promised if those demands were not met? The deaths of every man, every woman, every child inside the performance hall. The siege of the Dubrovka Theatre is about to begin. In exactly 0 moments of history has post-Soviet Russia been an easy place to be. From the years of organized crime lords during the 1990s, to the rising authoritarianism of the 2000s, to the international manipulations of the 2010s, and finally, the war years of the 2020s, this period of Russian history has been, well, difficult at best. But through the 33 years at the time of writing that Russia has stood alone in the modern era, it's faced few trials more difficult than the Second Chechen War. By the time of the Dubrovka Theatre siege, the most difficult months of the Second Chechen War had already come and gone. Across the later months of 1999 and the early months of the year 2000, Russian troops and pro-Russian militias had waged brutal open combat against a massive separatist faction hailing from the region of Chechnya on what Russia recognized as its own territory. The Chechen separatist movement has a reputation for its own extreme violence, particularly the use of terror attacks against civilian targets. Although the pre-war years in Russia involved a sort of murkiness around who was attacking what and why that we're just not going to get into today, suffice it to say that when Russia decided to visit war upon Chechnya, it resolved to pull no punches. By the end of the year 2000, Russia, under the new Prime Minister and then acting President Vladimir Putin, had laid waste to Chechnya from the air, swept across the landscape with great military force, displaced hundreds of thousands of Chechen civilians, and besieged and then almost completely destroyed the Chechen capital city of Grozny. After the bulk of the fighting eventually resolved in Russia's favor, Chechnya was placed under the control of one Akhmat Kadyrov, a former revolutionary fighter who had switched sides at the start of the Second Chechen War and eventually was installed as head of a pro-Moscow government. His son, Ramzan, by the way, still rules Chechnya today, carrying on his father's legacy with an iron fist. The pro-independence separatists moved to the countryside, transitioning from organized military formations to a guerrilla resistance. Suicide attacks, assassinations, bombings, and small unit raids became their weapons of choice, and their tactics evolved as well, no longer bothering to try and hold large chunks of territory, but instead bleeding the Russians dry in hopes that their continued occupation of Chechnya would begin to appear unsustainable. At the heart of the Chechen network was one Shamil Basayev. A longtime leader of anti-Russian forces in Chechnya, Basayev had made a name for himself among the Chechen people in times of both war and peace. He'd been a militant for years before the First Chechen War, but after his mother, his 2 children, his sister, and brother, and several other family members were killed in a Russian airstrike that also claimed his home, Basayev had taken revenge at the helm of a brigade of nearly 200 Chechens in their first attack outside Chechnya in Russia's modern era. When that attack, known as the Budyanovsk hospital hostage crisis, forced a ceasefire to turn the tide of the First Chechen War, Basayev would lead the eventual operation to retake Grozny. In the interwar years, he'd become Chechnya's deputy prime minister after coming in second in the Chechen presidential elections of that same year. Peace did not seem to agree with him, and after building a network of warlords and leading an attack into the neighboring Russian Republic of Dagestan, Basayev found himself poised perfectly to lead the Chechen defense when war with Russia broke out again. While Russia was devastating his republic, Basayev was leading the defense of Grozny and recovering from the loss of his foot, where a video has since circulated of Basayev watching his own amputation, seeming almost bored with the use of a local anesthetic. By 2002, Basayev was settled in as Chechnya's insurgent leader and widely recognized as one of the most wanted men on earth, behind only the likes of Osama bin Laden. It had a multi-million-dollar bounty placed on his head. Russia had decided to claim that their forces had killed Basayev for the umpteenth time, and yet he remained elusive in the Chechen countryside. While it's unclear just how much of the attack on the Dubrovka theater was Basayev's idea versus how much his choice to claim the attack after the fact was meant to divert attention from other Chechen leaders, what's far less murky is that an attack on a target in Moscow would have been very much his style. Basayev believed in the value of bringing the pain of war home to ordinary Russians who were used to regarding affairs in Chechnya at an arm's length, and after multiple years carrying out hit-and-run attacks while Moscow grew more self-assured, an attack on Russian civilians around this time would have been par for the course in terms of the tactics and strategies Basayev was known to prefer. But with such a high-risk strike into Moscow, Basayev wouldn't be attending in person. Instead, he tapped one Movsar Barayev for the job, who, because of his surname's similarity to Basayev's, we're instead going to refer to by his most common alias, Suleimanov. Movsar Suleimanov was a young man in 2002, just 23 years old, and had recently been anointed as a prominent Chechen warlord after the death of his uncle, Arbi Barayev. After his uncle's demise, Suleimanov had come into the leadership of a Chechen militia called the Special Purpose Islamic Regiment, or SPIR, a terrorist cell with a particular taste for kidnapping and hostage-taking. Never numbering more than 100 fighters at a time, SPIR was believed to have close ties with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and under Shamil Basayev's direction, Movsar Suleimanov would select a group of armed and very dangerous men and women from SPIR and in ones and twos from other Chechen units. Together, they would form the so-called Suicide Squad of the 29th Division. They were made up of somewhere between 40 and 50 experienced and highly lethal Chechen fighters, nearly half of whom were women soldiers who were regarded to be among Chechnya's most determined soldiers. Many among their number had been widowed in the conflict. Well-funded, signed off by not only Basayev, but most likely a range of other warlords, and equipped with small arms, explosives, and suicide belts handed out predominantly to the women soldiers, the Suicide Squad of the 29th Division knew damn well that they were unlikely to survive their mission. After what contemporary Chechen sources describe as somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks of training, the squad would infiltrate Moscow, laying low, avoiding arrest, and probably paying off any police who were too willing to take action against Chechens in the Russian capital. When the day finally arrived, on the 23rd of October 2002, there was no stopping them. The hostage crisis began midway through Act 2, just after 9 p.m. Under the direct command of Movsar Suleimanov, the Chechens drove up to the theater in a single bus, masked and heavily armed. They stormed the theater en masse, firing warning shots into the air and securing entry and exit points around the theater hall. Although nearly 100 people would recognize the danger and be able to flee amidst the confusion, most wouldn't, including children, the elderly, and much of the performance cast. While many inside the theater were understandably terrified by the incident, they chose to cooperate with the Chechens rather than try to react violently, which was a good call considering how numerous and well-armed the separatists were. Said one hostage, Lena Baranovskaya, after the fact, quote, "My son and I shook with fear. Everyone was shaking so hard that the entire row was rocking. My husband said, 'Calm down. We're going to be here for a long time.'" Once the theater was secured, Suleimanov got to business. The hostages were processed, and anyone who was able to produce a foreign passport was given the right to leave. That decision would see several dozen foreign-born individuals freed in the early hours of the siege. Freed alongside them after the building was first surrounded were children, pregnant women, people who needed medical treatment, and any Muslims inside the theater. The remaining hostages were gathered in the theater hall, with the orchestra pit designated as the area where all parties present would have to relieve themselves for the time being. Hostages were allowed to use their phones, and quickly word got out to relatives and friends who were able to relate word to the Russian authorities. The terrorists had mines, grenades, bombs, booby traps, and explosive vests. Said one hostage, Irina Kumanova, about the explosives, quote, "The Chechen women showed us their bomb belts. All they'd have to do was connect 2 wires. If just one of them did this, her bomb alone would set off all the other bombs nearby." By the time Russian troops and police had arrived in force to begin the siege, the theater was already fortified, and it was time to make demands, something Suleimanov and his deputies did via videotape and telephone conversations with media organizations. Said the militants in their primary video statement, quoting, "Every nation has the right to their fate. Allah has given us the right of freedom and the right to choose our destiny. And the Russian occupiers have flooded our land with our children's blood, and we have longed for a just solution. People are unaware of the innocent who are dying in Chechnya, the sheiks, the women, the children, and the weak ones. And therefore, we have chosen this approach." The statements made it explicitly clear that the hostage-takers were willing to martyr themselves and kill their hostages as well if the demands were not met. Those demands, given explicitly, were the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of Russian forces from Chechnya within the span of 1 week and the cessation of artillery and air attacks within a day. Deadly house-to-house attacks inside Chechen cities and towns would have to stop, and Vladimir Putin himself would have to declare publicly that he was working to bring an end to the war. Way longer than a week for a full withdrawal, and hostages would begin to die. Kill any of the hostage takers, and 10 hostages would die as retribution. Said one of the gunmen on tape, quoting, "I swear by God, we are more keen on dying than you are keen on living." Outside the theater, the Russian response was already in full force. Local police, federal security forces, and even the Russian Spetsnaz special forces would take up positions around the theater backed up by armored vehicles. Vladimir Putin cancelled an imminent trip to meet with world leaders overseas, including American President George W. Bush, and the Russian government opened lines of negotiation with the militants. An early offer for the Chechens to leave to any country of their choosing outside Russia or Chechnya was rebuffed. In response, the Chechens are believed to have ordered or forced hostages to make a direct appeal to Putin to end the Chechen War and avoid attacking the theater directly. The early hours of the siege were marked by a pair of escapes, by 2 women who managed to find an exit. They were also marked by the siege's first death. At around 1:30 a.m. on the 24th of October, a Russian civilian found their way through police lines and entered the theater, allegedly acting on her own. The civilian, 26-year-old local resident Olga Romanova, began calling to hostages once inside, urging them to stand up against the terrorists who'd taken them captive. The Chechen rebels, believing her to be an operative for Russia's internal security agency, the FSB, shot and killed her on the spot. The body was later allowed to be removed from the building by a Russian team of paramedics. Recounted one hostage, Ilya Lysak, she pushed Basayev aside. "Get out," she said, and turned to the audience. "What are you all scared of? He's just a clown, and this is all a big farce." One of the gunmen pushed her through the side doors and then fired his Kalashnikov 3 times. The quote ends. Said former hostage, Lena Baranovskaya, "A dreadful deep silence fell over the auditorium. It froze our bodies, our hearts, and our souls." The first full day of the siege would be a who's who of Russian public life. Joseph Kobzon, a Ukrainian-born Russian singer and member of parliament, was able to negotiate for the release of several people, including 3 children. Several Chechen and Russian politicians, political reformer Boris Nemtsov, and journalist and future presidential candidate Irina Kakhamada all attempted to negotiate, and even former Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev offered his services, although as an informal persona non grata in Russia at the time, his offer was declined. The Red Cross was on the scene, and the militants demanded that Doctors Without Borders send representatives as well. Foreign embassies made contact with the terrorists and received firm pledges to release all foreigners inside, and a total of 39 hostages would make it out over the course of the day. The 24th wasn't without its trials. An FSB negotiator who attempted to enter the theater was warded away with gunshots, and Akhmad Kadyrov, pro-Russian leader of the recognized Chechen state, refused to take part in the negotiations, even though the militants promised the release of 50 hostages if he showed up. Finally, a Russian listening operation tried to snake its way through the theater's plumbing, but ended up bursting a hot water pipe, earning the ire of the hostage takers. But eventually, the first full day of the siege had ended. Hostages released, 39. Death toll, 1. On October the 25th, the parade of prospective negotiators only continued. Among those called to the scene was a journalist named Anna Politkovskaya, who'd become a trusted source on the Second Chechen War and would later be assassinated in Moscow in a hit widely regarded as being ordered, or at least endorsed, by Vladimir Putin. Also on the premises was former Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov, a former president of the Russian Republic of Ingushetia called Ruslan Ushev, and a British conflict journalist named Mark Franchetti. Conspicuously absent was anybody with the direct authority to speak for Putin and his government, despite requests from the hostage takers that a representative be sent. Over the course of the day, 8 Russian children between the ages of 7 and 13 years old were released alongside 7 Russian adults. 4 hostages from Azerbaijan were allowed to leave as well. The hostage takers consented to plans to release their foreign hostages to representatives from their home nations. The head of the FSB, Nikolai Patrushev, offered assurances that the hostage takers' lives would be spared if the hostages were allowed to leave safely. When a group of Russian doctors and medical specialists entered the theater, they brought back confirmation that the hostages were largely unharmed and that their captors had not yet shown any inclination to resort to violence in keeping them contained. Blankets, food, and changes of clothes were brought into the theater, and outside, the families of hostages arrived en masse to begin campaigning for their release. Perhaps most important, the leader of the terrorists, Movsar Suleimanov, gave an interview to Russian media. Although Suleimanov would reiterate that he and his followers fully expected to die, he emphasized that they did not intend to do any harm to the hostages or create a firefight with the Russian troops waiting outside. But The relative calm of that day, as well as the progress made toward ending the hostage situation, would be complicated over the course of the coming night. That evening, several people would die. A man named Gennady Vlach, who had claimed that his son was among the hostages, rushed the theater and was able to get inside, but he was executed by the hostage takers and was apparently unable to locate his son before he was captured. Another hostage, named Denis Gribkov, made an attempt to fight back against the hostage takers, attacking a pair of women among the insurgents who were guarding a large IED. The hostage takers' attempts to stop Gribov were initially unsuccessful, but the shots they fired would kill another man, Pavel Zakharov, and severely wound a third hostage, Tamara Starkova. Gribkov would be stopped shortly after and was found executed in the wake of the siege. Outside the building, 2 Spetsnaz operatives would be wounded by a grenade thrown at them by the hostage takers after the Spetsnaz troops had infiltrated the informal buffer zone between the theater and the Russian forces outside. In total, 19 people had been released that day, 3 had died, and 3 more had been wounded. In the theater, some among the hostages seemed to know that something was coming. Said one, Ilya Lysak, "I've often heard it said that people have a premonition of death. I never believed it. But I'd worked in the orchestra for 2 years and knew all the actors and musicians really well. The ones who died all had this look in their eyes. They weren't there anymore." What the hostage takers didn't yet know was that the small threats they perceived inside the theater were nothing compared to what was coming next, and that the movements of the Spetsnaz outside were likely related to a larger operation. While Russian authorities had taken part in efforts to negotiate a peaceful release of the hostages, and had even allowed non-government negotiators to make their own attempts, they were also working toward a potential resolution by force. On paper, it was a plan that seemed as if it might thread the needle between a proactive measure to end the crisis and a non-lethal option that stood the best chance of saving the hostages inside. The middle ground was a gas attack, using a substance that Moscow hoped would incapacitate the hostage takers by putting them to sleep. Once they and the hostages had passed out, the Russian forces could take the building without opposition, arrest the separatists, and wrap up the incident without a single bullet fired in the conclusion. The assault would go down in the small hours of the morning, Saturday the 26th, and with any luck, it would be wrapped up by breakfast. The operation was practiced beforehand at a local cultural center with the same floor layout as the theater, and it had been in preparation just hours after the crisis began. The hours before the plan kicked into action did not go easily. Overnight, Spetsnaz forces moved into position around the theater building, backed up by other elite paramilitary forces. But as the night wore on, the peace outside the theater was interrupted by goings-on inside. As Russian Deputy Interior Minister Shamil Basayev would claim after the fact, 2 women had been executed inside the theater, prompting the Spetsnaz to attack the building prior to when the main assault was set to begin. The Spetsnaz raid, though, would have gone down anyway, in what was most likely a diversionary attack meant to make the hostage takers believe that Russia wouldn't be attacking again until they'd worked out a plan B. The raid didn't last long. The Spetsnaz ended up pulling back without any reported further casualties on either side. Then at 5 a.m, the assault began. Within moments, aerosolized gas began streaming in through the theater vents, although whether it was distributed through a specially cut hole in the wall or pumped through the ventilation has been subject to debate after the fact. The militants inside, sleep-deprived, nervous, and prone to quick reactions, initially reacted with hostility. The few who had gas masks put them on and fired wildly on the Russian positions outside, although, as far as has been reported, there were no deaths at that time. The hostages were instructed to get down and cover their heads while sitting in their theater seats, and one of them, a news correspondent named Anna Adranova, made a call to the radio show Echo of Moscow. In real time, she reported the start of the gas operation, quoting, "It seems to us that the Russians have started something. Please give us a chance. If you could do anything, please do. Don't know which gas it is, but I see their reactions. They don't want our deaths, and our officials want none of us to leave alive. That's what our government has decided, that no one should leave from here alive." Over the course of the next hour and a half, the Spetsnaz waited while the Chechens who'd remained conscious intermittently started shooting out at the Russian forces outside. After those guns too eventually fell silent, the Spetsnaz chose their moment. At about 6:30 a.m. local time, Russia blew the doors to the theater and made a full assault. The few terrorists who were still conscious would be killed in the ensuing firefight. So too were each of the unconscious terrorists put to death inside the theater rather than being arrested. The women wearing explosive belts and guarding IEDs were openly acknowledged to have been killed where they slept in order to avoid a bomb being triggered either intentionally or via convulsions. Although conflicting media reports did indicate that a couple of militants might have been arrested alive, the Kremlin has since held firm to the claim that every hostage taker inside the building was killed. After an hour of intermittent firefights with the terrorists who'd retreated to other parts of the building, the Spetsnaz eventually declared victory and the siege of the Dubrovka theater was over. As the dust settled around the Dubrovka theater, it seemed for a moment as if Russia had achieved a total victory. The hostage-takers had been overwhelmed and neutralized, and although a couple of Russian troops had been injured, none had paid for the siege liberation with their own lives. Aside from a handful of hostages who were killed over the course of the siege, nearly all of the people initially taken captive had been liberated by or before the final assault. The bombs and booby traps the militants had prepared had all come to naught, and the Chechens' grand attempt to force a ceasefire had now failed. For a Russian nation and a Russian president who had endured a long list of domestic and international black eyes in recent years, it seemed as if the resolution of the theater siege was all the vindication they had been waiting for so long. But outside the building, the gathered press soon began to realize that something had gone horribly wrong. At about 7 a.m, the hostages began to be carried out, and while very few, if any at all, showed signs of having been caught in the crossfire, they looked very, very different from what onlookers had expected of people incapacitated with a sleeping gas. Said Guardian reporter Nick Patton-Walsh, who was at the scene, quoting, "Their faces were waxy white and drawn, their eyes open and blank. The gas was killing people, and although many of the hostages appeared to be alive and unconscious, there was no telling who among them would remain alive and who was on death's door. The unconscious were placed face up on their back with rain coming down, and several dozen would aspirate on their own vomit or swallow their tongues, dying before they were ever even tended to. Although there were medical workers at the scene, there were nowhere near enough. No doctors were present, and there weren't enough ambulances either. Worst of all, the paramedics had no idea what the hostages had been dosed with, and the authorities at the scene weren't telling. Very quickly, the Russian state spin machine pivoted into damage control, and because the authorities had gotten a head start on assessing the situation while the hostages were inside the theater, they could control information access and rapidly began distributing their own account of what had happened. The leaders of the crisis headquarters allegedly reported to families at first that there were no fatalities among the hostages, even as the bodies of the dead were already being loaded onto 2 city buses. Then reports began to come in that children were among the dead, something that Russia's official statements flatly denied. Hours later, Russia would state that 67 people had died, all of them killed by the hostage takers, but again, they denied that any children or foreigners had been among them. Putin appeared live in a television address that day, asking for forgiveness for the failure to save everyone, but insisting that Russian authorities had, quoting, achieved the near impossible, saving hundreds of people. And while the Kremlin was putting its spin on the story, it was also locking down access. Hospitals where hostages were being treated were posted with armed guards, while doctors were prohibited from allowing any hostage to leave, supposedly so that Russia could assess whether any of them had actually been among the hostage takers. The living hostages were spread around over a dozen hospitals, and their families were given no information on who had gone where. In fact, there was not even an official admission that any of the family's relatives were alive or dead. Eventually, the government was forced to admit that a minimum of 25 children had been killed, among at least 118 dead, although it remained mum for days about what had killed them. Local officials were more transparent. The city of Moscow's health committee chairman, Andrei Setovsky, admitted the day after the Spetsnaz assault that nearly every person who had died had been killed by gas. In the following weeks, news came out that the Russian handling of the aftermath was even worse than initially feared. Chechens among the hostages had apparently not been rendered medical treatment, and a total of 73 hostages weren't given any medical attention, including 6 people under the age of 18. Those who did survive reported that money and valuables had been stolen. Those thefts would later be pinned on an FSB officer who quite conveniently died in a car crash. Russia worked to minimize the theory that the dead had been killed by gas, then tried to blame the effects of the victims' conditions on the hostage takers rather than their use of gas. And all the while, even as many of the survivors were forced to spend days in intensive care, Russia never revealed the true nature of the gas that they'd used. The death of the Dubrovka theater siege has never been definitively established. Bodies went missing, people remained unaccounted for, and Russia, quite clearly, was willing to obscure and falsify information wherever it could. The best estimates of the death toll cluster around 130 fatalities, while of the 700 or so surviving hostages, many were left permanently disabled, often reporting respiratory issues and memory loss. The listed cause of death for every officially acknowledged hostage, well, that was terrorism. Speaking of the terrorists in question, estimates of the dead range from 40 on the low end to upward of 50. Russia has maintained that no Chechen separatists were recovered alive. In the months following the incident, the one question that took precedence above all others was on the nature of the gas that had killed so many people. There were a few early clues. For example, one hostage interviewed by the New York Times had stated that the gas had smelled of ginger and grass, while reports emerged after the fact that hospitals had been instructed to use naloxone in the treatment of survivors. Naloxone, by the way, is a drug that counteracts opioids like heroin, and it was in short supply on the ambulances at the scene of the theater, a critical failure in planning that likely led to dozens of preventable deaths. Not only that, but it's a drug that must be administered quickly, meaning that by the time the assault ended 2 hours after it began, it would have already been much too late. According to one Russian expert, the gas in question had been developed for military purposes, and authorities should have known that administering it to hostages without rapid treatment would likely have led to numerous fatalities. Over the following years, the international medical community eventually reached a broad consensus that the gas was most likely a derivative of fentanyl, a very powerful pain relief drug that's currently, as we write in 2024, responsible for a global opioid crisis with a particularly high death toll. The Russian government has still never offered any clarification. In Chechnya, Shamil Basayev would wait until the following week to claim responsibility, ultimately proclaiming on a militant website that he and his forces had prepared the attack in secret without the knowledge of elected Chechen leader Aslan Mashkadov. Said Basayev, "The next time, those who come won't make any demands, won't take any hostages. The main goal will be destroying the enemy and exacting maximum damage." Russian state media continued to accuse Aslan Mashkadov after the fact, stating that the Chechen leader had taken a primary role in organizing the hostage crisis and that Basayev was simply covering for him. What the reality of the situation was would likely remain unresolved, but the facts that such a hostage crisis was firmly within Basayev's typical modus operandi and that the two men had a strained relationship at best make the idea of Mashkadov's oversight somewhat less likely. At the highest levels of Russian politics, the siege was used in roughly the same way that the Putin government has used many similar incidents in the past, to justify further restrictions placed on the Russian people in the name of security. In the weeks following the attack, the Russian Duma, the lower house of parliament, would approve legislative amendments that severely restricted media reporting on counterterrorism operations, a broad label that has since been applied to converge on basically anything that Russia does to its international enemies. So too was coverage of Chechnya starkly limited, and the publication of, quote, propaganda or justification of extremist activity was also banned. Like the counterterrorism label, the justification of extremist activity label provided Russia with a broad enough brush that it's been able to levy that accusation against a wide range of political opponents and media members. Decades after the fact, hundreds of families in Russia bear the scar of the Dubrovka theater siege to this day. Many bear a lasting rage toward the Russian government for the deaths of their parents, siblings, spouses, children, and friends. The government has only done the most minimal work to attempt to make amends, never releasing an investigative report or taking responsibility for the deaths of over 100 people who simply did not need to die. The carelessness with which the Russian authorities handled the siege, the bravado and complete lack of forethought in the use of what was clearly intended to be some show of cunning and deception, and the decision to end the siege violently when the hostage takers were actively willing to negotiate and release their captives, all targets of their outrage, but all remain fundamentally unaddressed by the Russian government itself. Allegations have long since circled that the Russian FSB might have actually been involved with the Chechen hostage takers, and the aftermath of the event has seen a number of suspicious or allegedly involved FSB officers die untimely deaths. International courts have firmly rejected the contention that the deaths of the hostages were caused by illness, a lack of food or water, or anything else other than the distribution of aerosolized fentanyl. Yet their calls for reparations have gone ignored. Said a Kazakh survivor named Svetlana Gabareva, whose 13-year-old daughter, Sasha Gabareva, and American-born fiancé Sandy Burka were both killed, quote, "The authorities do not want to take responsibility for the mess they organized instead of a rescue operation. It cannot be called a rescue operation. It was a real mess." And to conclude today's episode, we'll leave you with the words of another Russian citizen, Dmitry Molodov, whose 14-year-old daughter, Nina, was killed by the gas. Our state failed to save our loved ones. It is a monster, a cannibal, that devoured the lives of our relatives for the sake of political ambitions.